Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan, His Life and Times by Stanley Walpert. Chapter 9. President Bhutto picks up the pieces. December 1971 to July 1972. As the sun set on December 1971, Pakistani fighter bombers attacked airports in Amritsar, Agra, Srinagar, and half a dozen smaller Indian cities, and the army advanced across the international border from Sindh into Rajasthan. The total war Zulfi had been pressing Yahya to fight was at last begun now that Zulfi was back in power. He advised Yahya much the way he had advised Ayub during the 1965 war. The F 86 Sabre jets and Mirages hit few of their targets, however, making some runways and hangars inoperative but hardly destroying India's air force on the ground. Nor did Pakistan's demoralized army get very far, for Indian air power was ready to immobilize Pakistani armor, quickly bringing Pakistan's western offensive to a halt. In the east, Jessore fell on 7th December, and India's long columns of Soviet built trucks towing 105 mm artillery, jeeps mounted with recoilless rifles, and troops carriers kept rolling on towards Dhaka. Zulfi flew to New York on 8th December 1971, hoping to recoup on the diplomatic front some of the ground Pakistan had lost in Bangladesh. We will not rest, he assured his cheering countrymen who had come to Karachi's airport to see him off. Not if it took 1,000 years to clear Indian aggression from the sacred soil of Pakistan. He rested a bit at the pier, however, before going to the Waldorf Towers for breakfast with Henry Kissinger in the UN Ambassador George Bush's suite on 11th December. Chinese wallpaper and discreet waiters made one nearly forget that 8,000 miles away, the future of my guest's country hung by a thread. Kissinger recalled. Elegant, eloquent, subtle, Bhutto was at last a representative who would be able to compete with the Indian leaders for public attention. The legacy of distrust engendered by his flamboyant demeanor and occasionally cynical conduct haunted Bhutto within our government, wrote Zulfi's American counterpart. I found him brilliant, charming, of global stature in his perceptions. He did not suffer fools gladly. Since he had many to contend with, this provided him with more than the ordinary share of enemies. Kissinger advised Bhutto that Pakistan would not be saved by mock tough rhetoric. It is not that we do not want to help you, it is that we want to preserve you. It is all very well to proclaim principles, but finally, we have to assure your survival. The next 48 hours would be decisive. We should not waste them in posturing for history books. Bhutto was composed and understanding. He knew the facts as well as I. He was a man without illusions, prepared to do what was necessary, however painful, to save what was left of his country. The following evening, Foreign Minister Bhutto told the UN Secretary Council, time is running out. Swaran Singh, Indira Gandhi's foreign minister, had just finished speaking when Zulfi rose to note that he knew him very well. Recalling what Kissinger told him, he said, I am not going to indulge in glib rhetoric or semantic contrivances because the situation is far too serious. The fat is in the fire and the time has come for us to act. Either we act individually or we act collectively. He also promised not to assume a sanctimonious attitude, admitting, we have made mistakes. Man is not infallible. Mistakes have been made everywhere by the Roman Empire, by the British Empire, by every state in the world. But states are not penalized for their mistakes. We are prepared to rectify those mistakes in a civilized spirit, in a spirit of understanding and cooperation. Thus, Zulfi launched upon one of the longest sanctimonious speeches. He retraced the history of Pakistan and its many conflicts with India, declaring, Pakistan is an ideal. It will last even if it is physically destroyed. We are prepared to face that physical destruction. We are prepared for the decimation of 120 million people. We will then begin anew and build a new Pakistan. The speed with which we could discard the tragic error of his past and plan optimistically for the future was part of his potent appeal to Pakistan's populace, to Punjabis as well as Sindhis, and to many tribes people along Pakistan's northwest frontier who faced death and adversity every day with courage and faith in God. We are too poor. There is too much misery, Zulfi said. Compassion was also part of his populist appeal. It is unfortunate that today we should be pitted against each other and one of us should dream semi barbarically of the liquidation and annihilation of another. It is simply not possible because then India will be pitted against 120 million people, valiant people with a great past, fighting for their independence, fighting for their dignity. So I offer a hand of friendship to India. Even as Zulfi was talking in New York, the new military commander of Pakistan's forces in the east at this time, General A.A.K. Niazi, Tiger, strode briskly towards the Intercontinental Hotel in Dhaka. Then, pausing to answer the questions of some foreign journalists, he perched himself on the chrome plated seat of his shooting stick, pearl handled pistol strapped to his ample waist, asked what the Pakistani army would do if the Indian army and the Mufti Bahini attacked Dhaka from all sides. Niazi replied, "What you fellows don't know is our hidden strength. I tell you, things are going to happen very quickly. Amazing things. By tomorrow or the next day, the whole situation will have changed. It doesn't matter whether we have enough men to defend the city. If you stay around, you'll see our men dying gloriously. We know what we are dying for. What does the enemy know? Remember, every Muslim soldier is worth 10 Hindus. We shall give a good account of ourselves. Gentlemen, the great battle of Dhaka is about to begin." Bangladesh exists on the lips of the government of India. Bangladesh exists in their mind. Bangladesh does not exist in reality. Zulfi shouted in New York. "We are prepared to die. We are not afraid to die. Our people are brave. We and India have shared 5,000 years of history. Believe me, Mexico might occupy the United States. Denmark might occupy Germany. Finland might occupy the Soviet Union, but Pakistan will not be occupied by India in any circumstances. Remember that we shall fight and we shall fight for 1,000 years, as we have fought for 1,000 years in the past. We can continue." Nixon ordered the nuclear armed aircraft carrier Enterprise of the 7th Fleet to stream with its escort convoy into the Bay of Bengal, reportedly just to help evacuate US personnel if Dhaka fell. New Delhi recognized such nuclear weapons rattling for what it was, however, and Mrs. Gandhi resolved at this time to go full ahead with India's own plutonium production plans that would, in 2.5 years, trigger India's first nuclear explosion under the sands of Rajasthan, close enough to be felt in Sindh. Today, we are pitted against India and a great power. Zulfi charged in the Security Council. India is a big country, but today it is standing on the shoulders of a big power to look bigger. If it did not, it would not have been arrogant enough to defy the will of the General Assembly and the whole world expressed in a resolution calling for ceasefire, the end of hostilities, and the withdrawal of forces. Today, the Soviet Union has openly and brazenly come out in the support of India. Otherwise, the blockade of the Bay of Bengal would not have taken place. Kissinger had assured Zulfi of the White House's resolve to defend West Pakistan against any possible joint Soviet Indian attack. But it was now clear to all diplomats at the UN that nothing could keep Bangladesh under the sovereign control of Islamabad for many more days. General Niazi had, in fact, already signaled India of his intention to surrender. There was painfully little Pakistani resistance to the steady, multi pronged advance of India's gigantic army and air force that had moved big guns and bombs within range of Dhaka's suburbs. Take East Pakistan for 5 or 10 years. We will have it back. Zulfi challenged Swaran Singh, turning to aim his barbed words at the turbaned head of his bearded adversary. Believe me, Mr. Foreign Minister, this is the lesson of history from the beginning of time. What belongs to a people will go to that people. East Pakistan is a part of Pakistan, you know this. Remember this well. That would remain an ambition and frustration to lure Bangladesh back to its pre 1975 status. Today, the Indian Foreign Minister said that the problem could only be resolved if a representative of the so called Bangladesh government, which was created by India, was represented in the Security Council. Bhutto continued. Are you going to permit this kind of precedent when provincial parties and those who are clients of larger countries should be have representation before the Security Council? Sometimes the Sikhs will come to the Security Councils, sometimes the Punjabis. We can also bring some people from India. We have not indulged in any kind of mischief. But give us some time. Listen, Sardar Singh, Golden Bengal belongs to us, not to India. We will fight to the bitter end. We will fight to the last man. In every village and hamlet, as the Indian troops entered, joyful Bengalis rushed out to greet them with garlands and marigolds and tearful cries of Joy Bangla. The flag of Bangladesh was everywhere, over huts and trees, draped on Soviet guns, attached to the antennas of Indian tanks. The words of Gurudev, divine teacher, Rabindranath Tagore's anthem, Amar Sonar Bangla, our golden Bengal, rang out from the lungs of millions who had waited in silent terror for 9 months for this birth dawn of freedom. O mother, during spring the fragrance of your mango groves maddens my heart with delight. O mother, during autumn in your blooming fields I have heard your sweet murmuring laughter. What beauty, what shade, and what love, what affection I perceive beneath the banyan trees. My life passes in the shady villages, homes filled with rice from your fields. They madden my heart with delight, O mother. I am poor, but what little I have, I lay at thy feet, and it maddens my heart with delight. Bhutto spoke again the next day in New York about how bravely Dhaka was being defended and how fiercely Pakistan would continue to fight. But the 2 week Bangladesh war was almost over. Tiger Niazi was ready to turn his pearl handled revolver over to General Aurora, abjectly touching his forehead to the head of the stalwart Sikh hero of Bangladesh within days of Zulfi's sanctimonious threats and promises. On 15th December, Bhutto addressed the Security Council for the third and final time, full of bravado. So, what if Dhaka falls? So, what if the whole East Pakistan falls? So, what if the whole of West Pakistan falls? We will build a new Pakistan. We will build a better Pakistan. Mr. President, you referred to the distinguished Foreign Minister of India. How is he distinguished when his hands are full of blood, when his heart is full of venom? I extended a hand of friendship to him the other day. I am talking as the authentic leader of the people of West Pakistan who elected me at the polls in a more impressive victory than the victory that Mujibur Rahman received in East Pakistan. But he did not take cognizance of it. I say what Cato said to the Romans: Carthage must be destroyed. If India thinks that it is going to subjugate Pakistan, Eastern Pakistan as well as Western Pakistan, because we are one people, we are one state, then we shall say, Carthage must be destroyed. We shall tell our children and they will tell their children. 18-year-old Benazir, down from Cambridge to be with her father, was sitting just behind him. We will fight for 1,000 years. India is intoxicated today with its military successes. So you will see, this is the beginning of the road. Today it is Pakistan. We are your guinea pigs today. But there will be another guinea pig. You want us to lick the dust? We are not going to lick the dust. I am not a rat. I have never ratted in my life. I have faced assassination attempts. I have faced imprisonments. I have always confronted crises. Today, I am not ratting, but I am leaving your Security Council. I find it disgraceful to my person and my country to remain here a moment longer. Legalize aggression. I will not be party to it. We will fight. We will go back and fight. My country beckons me. You can take your Security Council, he thundered as he tore up his notes on the resolution, tossing the paper aside. Here you are. I am going. Stiff legged Zulfi strode out of the chamber. Benazir and the rest of the delegation followed. My father was very upset as he walked and walked, seeing the devastating repercussions ahead for Pakistan. Benazir recalled. Now Pakistan will have to face the shame of surrender to India. There will be a terrible price to pay. He agonized. Niazi surrendered on 16th December, signing a former instrument in Dhaka's race course the next afternoon and giving up for his entire army, 93,000 of Pakistan's best soldiers and supporters. It was the most ignominious defeat in the nation's history, one that even Zulfi Bhutto's rhetoric was unable to conceal from the millions in West Pakistan who had hoped and prayed and desperately tried to believe every brave lie he told them. Piles of dead soldiers lie about the roads and ditches at the entrance to Dhaka. Gavin Young, the only British correspondent left in Dhaka at this time, wrote for London's Observer on 19th December. With the advance guard of the Indian Army, the first Indian general into the city, Major General Gandharo Nagra, said, casualties are severe, very messy. I asked him if he had already met General Niazi. Oh, yes, he said. He was very happy to see me. We knew each other at college. That first morning of the ceasefire, officers who had been comrades at the same staff college stood looking at one another, wondering who to blame. The Indian troops, dusty in buses, jeeps, or trucks, took the garlands and embraces, the cries of Joy Bangla from leaping near hysterical Bengalis. Niazi told me, we surrendered because otherwise we'd have had to destroy the city between our two armies. We would have had to surrender in the end. So, what was the point in continuing? He gave a pale smile. He is not at all a brilliant man, but he is dedicated, not a political thinker. The war would have ended a week earlier, but President Yahya convinced Niazi that China and the United States would intervene on Pakistan's side. From New York, Zulfi flew to Key Biscayne, Florida, on 17th December to meet with Nixon and Kissinger on Bebe Rebozo's yacht, where he was assured of ample US military and monetary support. He boarded Pan American Flight 106 on the evening of 18th December for the long voyage home to the much diminished nation as he was now to lead, stepping down in Rome shortly after noon the next day. Air Marshal Rahim Khan had ordered the Pakistan International Airlines Boeing to be sent specially for Bhutto from Karachi. The flight to Islamabad allowed Zulfi to stop over in Tehran to confer with the Shah before finishing the last lap of his sadly triumphal trip home. The People's Party organized mass meetings from Pindi to Karachi as the word of Dhaka debacle cast its shadow across West Pakistan. The cry of death to Yahya alternated with long live Bhutto. Yahya had wished to hang on, but when his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Hamid Khan, briefed most of the junior officers at the National Defense College in Pindi on the morning of 20th December on the recent events in the East, he was met with angry questions and epithets. The younger officers were shouting, "Bastards, drunkards, disgraceful, and shame." Lieutenant General Hamid Khan's composure and that of the generals of the front row had completely collapsed. Yahya Khan had played his last card. The game was up. Zulfi landed at Pindi soon after the well staged drama in the NDC had convinced Yahya that he had lost more than a war. Mustafa Khar was waiting in his blue Mercedes inside the airport gate and drove with Zulfi directly to the well guarded president's house. The building, surrounded by high barbed wire walls with spiked steel gates, would soon become Zulfi's residence. Yahya was nervously waiting inside with the broken Pirzada and shaken Hamid, sipping whiskey without any soda. They conferred for an hour alone. Pakistan's two presidents, who knew each other well and had shared so many of the same pleasures. Yet, despite his Persian ancestry, Yahya was never really a political animal, only a military one. Now all his dreams of glory lay shattered behind him. Zulfi's lay ahead. Information Minister Rodad Khan had been called to the president's house by Yahya earlier in the day to make preparations to broadcast news of the transfer of power that was about to occur. "I went there with a very heavy heart," Rodad Khan recalled, for by then his elder brother, Khan Abdul Khalik Khan, the only PPP candidate from the Northwest Frontier province to win a seat in the National Assembly from Mardan against Wali Khan's ruling National Awami Party, had quarrelled with Bhutto. "He never forgave my brother," Redad Khan explained, and actually got up from his chair and threateningly approached him, going red in the face. He, Bhutto, had a very bad temper. Redad Khan and the then Cabinet Secretary Ghulam Ishaq Khan, now President of Pakistan, walked up and down the lawn outside the President's house as the new order and the new people arrived. Mumtaz Ali Bhutto, Dr. Mubashir, J. A. Rahim, and G. M. Jatoi. Finally, Yahya and Zulfi appeared. Then the transfer of power took place. Roedad remembered, chagrined that Bhutto had not so much as nodded to him. As he started to leave, however, Mr. Bhutto called my name and said, "You'll be hearing from me." Rodad returned to his information ministry office and waited for the phone to ring. Within the hour, it did. He picked up the receiver and heard as harsh and loud a voice as he'd ever recalled back. "Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, sir," he snapped in reply. "I want you to do the following," Zulfi ordered. "I want to address the nation tonight and I want you to outline some points and come to see me at 5 this evening." That evening, Redad learned he had been sacked from information and broadcasting, replaced by Zulfi's barrister, Hafiz Pirzada, who understands our aims and objectives. Bhutto explained. Pirzada, whose birthplace in Sindh was fewer than 50 miles from Larkana, had since 1958 shared Mr. Dingomal's Karachi chambers with Zulfi and Mumtaz. After Zulfi left Ayub's cabinet, Hafiz defended him in many cases, including the famous tractor misappropriation case and the confiscation of some 115 of his personal hunting and shooting weapons, which I got quashed, Pirzada recalled. Then we became very, very close friends. After the quashing of all other charges, Ayub's legal advisors had filed against Bhutto. Hafiz was appointed to Zulfi's party's central committee and would remain his barrister and a member of his cabinet for the next 5 years. Hafiz and his lovely first wife, Sadia, to whom Zulfi was strongly attracted, often dined with President Bhutto. Bhutto had been driven to Pindi's Punjab house after having been sworn in as the new president of Pakistan and chief martial law administrator. The two jobs he took over from Yahya on 20th December 1971. Yahya was left to pack up and vacate the president's house as soon as he could. Lieutenant General Gul Hassan had been called to Punjab House and thought, in fact, that he was going to meet Yahya there as he ascended the narrow stairs flanked by two 6'6" presidential house guards. Hassan asked the military secretary as he got to the upper floor, "What's the chief doing here?" "You'll see," was all that the general replied. He found Zulfi Bhutto waiting inside the drawing room with Air Marshal Rahim Khan. Bhutto embraced me and he started to cry and all put on. Gul Hassan recalled later, shocked to learn how creative a liar Bhutto could be and what a vicious man he was, totally unbalanced. Bhutto asked Gul Hassan to take over Yahya's job of army commander in chief, for that was one position Zulfi knew he could not fill. As current chief of general staff, Gul Hassan knew all the general officers personally, having trained many of them, including one obsequiously dark horse, Major General Ziaul Haq. Gul Hassan asked for time to think about it, still surprised to find himself with a new president. After the defeat just sustained by Pakistan's army, the job of commander in chief must have sounded more like a crown of thorns than a high honor. But Zulfi could not wait, insisting he had to address the nation that night, and the cornerstone of his speech was going to be my appointment. General Hassan felt flattered, but to give himself some moments to consider the offer, excused himself and went to the bedroom to mull it over. Half an hour later, he accepted on three conditions. The first being that he wanted no promotion, preferring to remain a lieutenant general. Zulfi agreed. And that night, Gul Hassan listened to the broadcast, which didn't start until several hours after it had been scheduled about 10:30 p.m. "We have appointed Gul Hassan as commander-in-chief," Bhutto said. The now retired general recalled. "He is a good soldier, popular with men, and he hasn't dabbled in politics. But I'm afraid he'll have to serve in the same rank, because we can't afford to fatten people unnecessarily." It was an out and out lie. So next morning, I rang him up and said, "What the hell are you doing?" He said, "This is politics." A few months later, the outspoken Gul Hassan would be packed off to Austria, where he served as Pakistan's ambassador for the next 3 years, whereupon he was posted to Athens till his retirement in 1977. My dear countrymen, my dear friends, my dear students, laborers, peasants, those who fought for Pakistan, I have come in at the very late hour, at a decisive moment in the history of Pakistan. Zulfi began, speaking over radio and television in English. "We are facing the worst crisis in our country's life, a deadly crisis. We have to pick up the pieces, the very small pieces, and we will make a new Pakistan, a prosperous and progressive Pakistan, a Pakistan free of exploitation, a Pakistan envisaged by the Qaid-e-Azam. That Pakistan will come. It is bound to come. This is my faith. But I need your cooperation. I am no magician. Without your cooperation, I simply cannot succeed. But with your cooperation, I am taller than the Himalayas. You must give me time, my dear countrymen, and I will do my best. I have been working round the clock." He apologized for not speaking Urdu but had opted for English because the world is listening. "I wish I were not alive today because of the way the Indians were gloating over their victory. But this was not the end. Rather, it was a new beginning for Pakistan. I have been summoned by the nation as the authentic voice of the people of Pakistan. By virtue of the verdict that you gave in the national elections, I would not like to see martial law remain one day longer than necessary. 1 second more than necessary. I want the flowering of our society. I want the suffocation to end. This is not the way civilized countries run. Civilization means civil rule, democracy. We will have to rebuild democratic institutions. We have to rebuild hope in the future. We have to rebuild a situation in which the common man, the poor man in the street, can tell me to go to hell. We have to make our government accountable. But because we are in such a terrible situation, you will have to give me some time. It was the sort of speech Pakistanis needed that cold December night, after a year of bitter disappointments and nightmares. Precious little of what Zulfi Bhutto promised would ever be brought to fruition. Yet, just hearing him say what he did in a so strong a voice helped lift the fallen spirit of millions who had felt less than a week earlier that their nation had died an ignominious death by surrender. I want to tell our gallant armed forces who have fought in East Pakistan that our hearts are with you, he said. We will not rest till we have redeemed your honor. These are not empty words. What made him think they might be construed as empty words? We will stand by you. We will be with you. If you go down, we will go down together. Remember my words. We are doing everything in our power. We will bend backwards to see to it that not a moment is wasted for the correct results. I do not want to spell them out because that may give indication to other people.